Hi guys and welcome to a new video. So today's question is DIY or buy a spot welder. Sequre was kind enough to send me a spot welder for a video. So what I'm going to do today is compare a DC spot welder that you can buy off the shelf versus my DIY spot welder. So a while back I built my own spot welder out of an old microwave transformer. We're going to compare cost, effectiveness and ease of use from one to another, and you're going to see which one is going to win in the end and which one I can recommend. I used to use a soldering iron, and yes, you can actually solder onto these cells. That works, but the issue is it creates a lot of heat on the cell and it damages the cell a little bit every time you're going to solder to it. Also, a side effect of that being is it's going to be really ugly and thick. There are going to be a lot of copper wires sticking and poking around on your battery. It's not going to look pretty. And also, if you own a spot welder, you're going to build a battery way faster than you could ever solder one. So it's a lot safer, it's a lot cleaner to just use a spot welder instead of soldering. Now, over the last few years, I had the honor of using a variety of different spot welders and techniques. I used heavy, big industrial DC spot welders. I used my AC welder, I used a K welder, I used all different kinds of welders. Let's start off with the simplest one, the DC spot welder. This basically takes electricity, for example from the grid, converts it to DC power, charges a huge capacitor with that, and then uses big MOSFETs that are essentially just switches that get turned on instantly and create a lot of power, and after a few milliseconds they open back up, and thus you can create a small amount of heat onto the nickel plates and solder them down. And that works great. Now these were the big industrial DC welders. What a lot of people buy right now, for example the Sequre welder or also the K welder, are welders that basically use a LiPo battery that has a high discharge current and also create the same effect. In this case you don't use a capacitor, but instead you use the battery itself as the main power source. And then there are also AC welders. What AC welders do is they convert the power that comes straight from the grid, 230 volts in Germany, and convert it down to, like in the case of my spot welder, 6 volts. You can basically now pull hundreds of amps and thus create only a few amps on the actual 230 volt wires, and you can spot weld with that. Because what spot welding essentially needs is high current, because current creates a lot of heat. If you want a clearer breakdown of everything, please check out the video I just linked here about how I built my first spot welder. So before we get started, I want to put here in a big disclaimer. If you build your own AC spot welder, you're going to deal with 230 volts. So if you have no idea what you're dealing with, don't attempt any of this. Don't work on 230 volts if you've never worked on electronics before. Also, even the battery powered spot welders are actually quite dangerous. There's for example the MOSFETs that need to handle the high current, or the freewheeling diodes that need to catch the current as soon as the MOSFETs shut off. So there's a lot of components that you need to deal with high current situations, and if they are not properly selected, you're going to run into big issues, and either your battery or your spot welder can explode. And in the worst case, you're basically burning a hole into the battery you're just spot welding, and thus you can create a huge fire. Also, here's a quick recommendation for anybody who actually wants to spot weld. A very important tip is to use a lower timing or a lower kilojoules. If you weld too strong, I've seen this many times, you're going to blow holes into the battery. This happened to my battery back then, this happened to a friend's battery, and I saw a lot of other batteries on the internet that died because of this. Use something a little bit more lighter and spot weld multiple times. It's way safer. As long as when you pull on the nickel actually gets stuck to the battery and rips, you did everything fine. Now comes the question, how do you even use a spot welder? Well, mine gets triggered with this shitty foot pedal. And the Sequre Spotwelder also offers this foot pedal, but it actually offers another solution, which is this big welding probe. You can basically just stick down and it instantly welds. It has a little switch inside, so it recognizes when the spring-loaded probes touch the actual metal, and as soon as that happens, the spot welder ignites and spot welds your nickel to the battery. This is especially useful because now you can weld with basically one hand and keep the nickel in place with the other hand. This is usually, if you're welding with a spot welder like mine, a pretty tedious task and is actually quite complicated to keep the nickel in place. Also another big bonus, but that's kind of my mistake, the Sequre welder uses way slimmer and way easier to move around cables. It's so much more comfortable spot welding with the Sequre welder than with the welder I built myself. And another really big benefit of this Sequre welder is the fact that it comes in just two little boxes. It's the battery and it's the welder, nothing more. This makes it so much more portable and easy and to move around on the desk. It's not bulky and heavy like the one I built. But there's a little catch. While you can just plug in my spot welder and start welding, with the Sequre welder you actually have to pre-charge the battery to full voltage. So before starting spot welding you should always charge it fully up, and when you're not using it, always discharge it to 3.8 volts per cell, because this will definitely prolong the lifetime of this battery. So which one is actually easier to use in the end? That point I think I have to give to the Sequre Spotwelder. It's so much simpler to get started. It's so much easier to just move it around a little bit. The flexible cables are way easier. With this one probe, it's so much handier. Now let's compare their effectiveness. How good do they actually perform? So one of the main benefits of an AC spot welder is actually the fact that it's AC, meaning the current flows in both directions. When you spot weld, for example, with like 30 milliseconds, you basically get a weld from both sides. What happens, kind of on an atomic level, to simplify it, is the electrons rush from the minus pole to the positive pole. They hit this nickel strip, and as soon as they hit the nickel strip, a lot of heat gets created. But the heat only comes from one side. It basically comes from the negative side and goes to the positive side, meaning the nickel strip gets kind of welded in one way, while the AC welder basically welds bidirectional. Both sides will look exactly the same on the AC welder, but on a DC welder you can actually sometimes spot a difference between where the negative and the positive pole was when you spot welded. So I wouldn't say this is necessarily an indicator of bad welding quality. I honestly wouldn't call this an issue at all. I think both are very, very effective, and I think both will work in the end. You will be happy with either one of them. Now the last point, cost and safety. Now this kind of goes hand in hand with what I just told you. If you build your AC welder yourself, you're running the risk of getting exposed to 230 volts, so that's already kind of not safe. And like I said, you can also easily destroy a battery and burn down your house if you want with a DC welder. They're not safe either. Neither one of these is 100% safe. But one thing is very clear to me. Switching high currents with semiconductors is actually quite a difficult task, and a lot of stuff can break. The MOSFETs can break, the freewheeling diodes can break, all kinds of things can die. Because when you have such high currents, the inductance in the wires basically creates a huge voltage as soon as you switch off. Because as you know how inductance works, inductance always wants to keep the current flowing and basically creates a huge voltage spike as soon as you want to switch it off. I would definitely say that DC spot welders actually have it way more difficult to actually maintain function, because on AC welders you can switch on the high voltage side. No semiconductor will ever touch the high current side, and you can only switch on the high voltage side, which makes it way more safe and way more predictable basically. Now if you want to build your own microwave spot welder, the cost is going to be really low. I basically got my microwave for free. You can get it on like Facebook Marketplace, eBay Classified, Craigslist, whatever you have. And usually people put in like for $5 or something like that their old microwave, and you can just pick it up. So getting the transformer is actually quite cheap. Then you have to buy the wire, you have to buy Arduinos, you have to buy the switching circuit, obviously you need to buy maybe a foot pedal, a solid state relay, a lot of wires and things like that. So that's probably going to cost you in the end somewhere around 50 to $100, depending on how high quality of a components you're gonna pick. More around $50 I would think. But I have to say it's a lot of work getting these old wires, getting the high voltage windings out of the transformer. That's going to take you at least like 3 to 4 to 5 hours. And here's another recommendation. If you actually want to build your own spot welder out of a microwave. Don't get a microwave with like a kilowatts of power or something like that. I got mine from a microwave that had like 1 kilowatt of power, but that also meant the transformer was insanely big. And the transformer is so big that as soon as I connect it to 230 volts, it pops the circuit breaker. So what I need to do is use a cable reel in series so that the circuit breaker doesn't pop. Like I said, this is not a perfect solution, so yeah, kind of use a little bit smaller microwave and you're going to be good. But now let's compare it to the battery powered spot welder. How much do they cost? The Sequre Spotwelder costs around $250 US. And there's also the K-welder, which costs around $190. But it doesn't come with this much stuff and things like that. So, but that's not even close to everything you're going to need to spot weld. You also need a LiPo battery, 3S LiPo battery with at least 5 amp hours of capacity and also 60C discharge rating. I got mine on Hobby King and that also cost me around like 40 euros or something, so another $50 US right there. But it's still not everything. Now you need to charge up the battery and you can't just do that with a lab bench power supply or something like that. Now you need a LiPo charger. I use the RC Toolkit one. I don't think they produce mine even anymore. And that costs you another like 40 bucks or something. Then you need a wall plug that goes down to 12 volts to basically power the charger, then to charge up the battery and then to use the spot welder, right? And that's another part that's going to cost you like $20. And to connect everything I just told you, you need also XT60 and XT90 connectors. And you need to build your own adapters and things like that. So it's also not just plug and play basically. There's also some work required to get it working. If you calculate it all down, buying something like the Sequre Spotwelder with all the necessary equipment will cost you something around in the neighborhood of $300 US. Would I recommend this setup? Honestly, if you have the money and you just want to build a battery, absolutely go for it. It's probably one of the best ways to build batteries. But I would also recommend taking a look at the K-welder, which is a little bit cheaper, offers a few other features here and there, and is also maybe a great option. So if you look on sites like Amazon or eBay, you will find a lot of these cheap, like $90-ish AC spot welders. These are usually huge boxes, they kind of look like this. They also work, but I've heard that they have real issues with reliability. I've heard from multiple people that just after a few batteries they will die. I personally wouldn't trust them that much, but if you're just building like, I don't know, a small battery every now and then, maybe they are also a great option. And then there are these really cheap, like 40 euros spot welders with a battery integrated. And I've also looked at some reviews of them, and honestly I think they kind of work actually. But I also see the same issue, they're not reliable at all. I'm guessing you can get away with spot welding like a small battery pack or something like that with like thin nickel strips. That's easily possible with these. If you want to build like bigger batteries and you want to spot weld a lot, I think it's really worth investing in either the K-welder or the Sequre Spotwelder. If you're just going to spot weld every now and then and you don't need anything expensive, maybe you can get away with the low reliability of these cheap Amazon and eBay spot welders. And only if you want to tinker around a lot, if you like getting your fingers dirty and actually like building stuff, then I would actually recommend building your own spot welder. Honestly, even though it's sometimes a really tedious task, you learn a lot in the end. It's a lot of fun. And I think that's what it's all about. So you kind of have to think about it like that. Do I want to learn how to build a spot welder, or do I just want to learn how to build a battery? Decide whichever one you want. And if you have the money to spare, just buy a spot welder and don't waste the 5 or 10 hours knocking out the secondary winding of an old transformer. So I think that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching. Ciao!